Let's see here. All right, hi everybody. Today is Thursday, February 1st, and this is the SIG Architecture weekly meeting. I'm your substitute moderator for today, Aaron Krickenberger. First up on our agenda, I wanted to hand off to Joe Bita to talk about an issue that came our way about the idea of changing the use of the term master to something else.
Yeah, I'm a little bit of the messenger here. I wasn't the one that proposed this, but it seems to be, this isn't the first time we've heard about this. Obviously, we avoided using the term slave, so that's good. We're not in that bind, and we changed minion to worker, but there seems to be more and more folks that keep tripping over the term master and finding that it brings to mind a bunch of distasteful, thoughts and history. Other groups have made this type of change. I think the term that you choose to replace it really depends on sort of the subtleties of sort of what that role is. I think, like primary and secondary doesn't really, work for us as much as perhaps something like control plane. So I think there's a question of, do we want to take this effort on? How do we want to go about doing this? What is the preferred sort of name that we want to pick instead if we do? Yeah, I'd love to get some thoughts from folks on that, and just also give people a heads up that this is something that we're seeing people bring up. In terms of so the question was, do you have an example of those groups? This isn't the first time. I think in the agenda notes there's a link to the issue that brings up this stuff. I don't have
Yeah, I just dropped it in. I can drop it in the chat as well.
So my take on this is personally, I think there's a lot of history for using master in CS when talking about distributed systems. So, I'm not offended by it, but that doesn't mean that, other people aren't, and this is an evolving thing. I think to some degree, if we try and say, oh no, everything's fine, I think we're being tone deaf, and I think we're just kind of fighting a tide here. So I think this is something that we should just bite the bullet, and the sooner that we get on top of this, the better.
Thank you.
So, I will point out that this is a group of a bunch of white dudes talking about this. Right. So, on the other hand, it's kind of a non-trivial effort. I did a quick grep through the code base. Tim Hawken, you probably did it too. Like, kubeadm definitely has a lot of work to do.
Yeah, cube up as well. Most of the places, so I also did this, there's the master API server, so package master, and then the cluster turn-up tools all use the term master and the label role master and things like that.
Yeah, so I don't know if we have a deprecation policy for label names or whatever, but we don't. So if you look at it from an API perspective, the word master doesn't show up in any APIs as far as Kubernetes is concerned, I don't think. And it shows up in one command line flag to kubelet, which is already marked as deprecated, so will be going away soon. But it's still a non-trivial amount of effort.
Yeah, this is something, I think Minion, we worked on for like 3 years to get rid of it, and it still appears in 5 places, I found the other day. I do think it's something we should transition away from, and even for reasons beyond just this. And I try to, in the architecture.md doc and in my presentations and other places, I usually use the term control plane, which is more inclusive, not just socially, but also technically. We have a lot of control plane components that don't necessarily run on a specific node. As we move more towards self-hosting and as more Kubernetes services host various aspects of the control plane, it's confusing. In HA scenarios, it's confusing. And the whole discussion of well-known labels and whatnot, I think also exposed that it doesn't really actually have a well-defined meaning. Some people run their etcd servers on different hosts than the API server, for example, which is arguably a reasonable thing to do, or at least to run the controller manager and scheduler on different nodes in the API server. So I actually think it's not a good notion to continue to promote on a technical level as well. And I would like to see us gradually move away from the term because it's becoming less and less relevant to the system.
Yeah, I was actually going to say the run level discussion, I think, has started to crystallize some of this as we had some discussions around initializers. And as the system gets more complex, we need to be a lot crisper about what depends on what in order for the system to function. And the problem with the role labels is, as you alluded to, Brian, was that the moment that the labels are about a collection of pieces, you lose that separation. So arguably the concept that we're really missing is the run label or the run level, right? Separating out this is what you actually need to boot. This is the next thing that you need to add. All the things after it depend on it. And if we had role labels where you needed to specifically identify those, you would need to mark the machines correctly. And it ties to security levels as well. So master was already failing to accurately represent that. And this is an opportunity to pivot to the correct terminology, or at least a better terminology, a better separation rather.
Yeah, and even in looking through part of the code base, I see things like it's called master, and the summary is the Kubernetes control plane. We're already starting to refer to that in some places, and the use of the term master has actually come up as being, some people have talked about how it is insensitive, and there are places where it's actually hit home with people. And so this isn't like pivoting before the need has shown up. It's like it's already being talked about as a need and a problem that's impacting people. And so we'd be looking at, okay, let's start the switch. And if it's like Minion, it'll take us years. But I think getting it moving.
The counterpoint though is we're not about to rename our branch master, right? Like every Git repository's default branch is called master.
We could take that one on separately.
Yeah, if you search for the term, that is the biggest problem with searching for the term, is that it appears in every GitHub link.
Yeah, so.
Oh God.
Okay. So what do concrete next steps look like here? Guidance back to docs that, okay, guys, the term is control plane, use liberally, and there will have to be an umbrella issue opened up to talk about how to move this forward at a technical level. And we welcome people who have the bandwidth to accomplish that technical issue. I mean, what do next steps?
Yeah. I think just setting the stake into the ground that we are moving away from the term master to control plane. And we think that dialogue needs to happen with docs, cluster lifecycle, and API machinery.
Well, and I think just colloquially, we all refer to things as the master instead of control plane. And so I think this is going to be a cultural sort of we just have to modify our own behavior about how we talk about this. Introducing this at the community meeting and say, hey, look, all of us are going to try and actually stop using the term master and retrain ourselves to say control plane.
Or a more appropriate component, like if you actually mean the API server. Although that gets confusing in scenarios like with aggregated API server. So we need maybe a technical term for that, but for that specific component.
So this sounds like a great plan, and I think so. As we talk about this, I think we should definitely emphasize both the technical reasons of it pays to be crisper when talking about what exactly it is we're talking about, but then also from a sort of social point of view. It's a matter of sensitivity too.
Well, as the, token non-white man here.
Oh, crap, there is a non-white man here.
Oh, we didn't see you, Caleb.
Yes, personally, I would love to have a cap on the engineering effort required to resolve the technical issue. Personally, I would love to see more outreach to underserved communities, not necessarily running around fixing CI breakages from package import renames. If we believe that it is important to put a stake in the ground socially, that would be my only 2 cents. And I think there are better, more effective ways of investing engineering effort.
I'm not sure I'm getting what you're saying there, Caleb. Could you go a little further?
There are the finite number of hours in the day. Yeah. I would love to not be prioritizing this work over, say, our mentorship efforts.
Right. This is a great example of a help wanted issue, except for those really gnarly problems inside of kubeadm, which I trust the kubeadm core maintainers.
Well, right. I mean, by making it clear what the guidance and the direction is, we can stop digging the hole deeper. Like kubeadm didn't start that long ago. If we had made this clear a year and a half ago, then that kubeadm, no work would be required there.
I'd also like to encourage us just to, before we adopt control plane, I mean, there is potentially offense to the word control, I could imagine, and many terms which I would not necessarily think are offensive may be offensive to certain communities. So before we just unilaterally change from one offensive word to another potentially offensive word, I think we need to do some homework and make sure we don't have to do this every year.
It would be nice. And
I'm fine with doing homework, but I think we're going off the deep end. Honestly.
Yeah.
Honestly, I mean, at least understanding the etymology of the usage here, again, speaking only as an individual, I don't find it particularly offensive. As a person who's worked on a Borg clone system for many years,
we describe.
But I think language is
so
language is mutable here, though. I mean, like. And I don't want to go off the deep end, but like the word like niggardly is no longer acceptable in polite society, even though the etymology has nothing to do with what people assume, right?
Indeed, go off the deep end there.
Yeah.
But I just want to say like there are examples of where the assumptions that people bring to it are disconnected from the history, and you just have to actually recognize that the current sort of impact that words have is there regardless of where the words came from.
I don't disagree with that, but it's going to be really hard to talk about technical issues if we cannot use the word control, and we cannot discuss control loops.
Yeah, I'm not going to say like I think control plane in my mind I think is probably gonna pass muster, but we definitely want to do some homework and socialize it.
Exactly. I'm fine with considering a change away from master because it does have some really serious negative historical connotations. And it's a reasonably bounded amount of work for us to do as compared to getting away from the word control. Like, we can't actually participate in sort of academic computer science and not use the word control. We can't just make up our own language here.
Master slave would also suggest that you cannot make up your own language.
While master,
that was Timothy.
Master may be rooted in academia and literature, like
or sprinkler systems or anything.
Right.
Like,
I mean,
exactly.
Okay, we're beyond beating the dead horse, and we're now starting to form a committee that declares this is the way we have always beaten dead horses like this. Let's move on, shall we?
I agree.
Joe, do you want to take the lead on issuing guidance back, or this is something I'm to do today?
I'm happy to call attention to this at the community meeting and say, hey, we talked about it in sort of our proposed change here. If folks have concerns with the new language or think that it's a bad way to go, I'm happy to take that offline. But I expect that most people will be like, it's going to be some work. It'll be a long thing, and we'll just start creating the right incentives to change.
Okay. I think the concrete follow-up would be to make sure you connect with the docs folks and make sure they have the appropriate level of guidance to feel capable to respond to the issue that's been followed with them. I can take that on today. But otherwise,
I'll at least I'm happy to after the meeting to put something in that issue and make sure that the SIG docs folks know, that hey, this is the preferred nomenclature going forward, but it's going to take time. Yeah.
Okay.
Do we have any, and can we prepare some drafted plan of what should we do to move from one word into a different and estimate our time consuming and so on? So
that's what I'm asking.
Just referring back to Caleb's notice about, does it make sense for us to invest our time and our efforts into this right now, right there, or we can do it like in a different time or in an extended period and so on. Yeah. So I'm totally in agreement with the renaming someday. At the same time, I'm coming back to Caleb's notice about
open an issue, put on a help wanted label, say we are unfortunately we're taxed for bandwidth for this release cycle. If you want to help out, please check out this issue. We greatly encourage help.
Yeah, I think this is doesn't need to be a fire drill. We just need to stop digging the hole deeper.
Yes.
Yeah. So like when I talk about this at the community meeting, I should go put something on the agenda there real quick. What I'm going to say is like, look, we talked about this. We want to pick a new name, and then we want to over time transition to that. There's no definitive timeline that we're talking about here. We're not going to twist people's arms, but we just want to start moving in the right direction.
Yeah, and invite people, because a lot of this is actually pretty easy documentation, comment renames, things like that throughout the code base. That is an easy way for somebody new to get a commit in and to get started contributing.
Yeah, so I think it's not just going to be a single term. There's going to be a number of terms that are more crisp, more precise. For example, I think OpenShift uses infrastructure nodes for nodes that are built on user workloads. So I definitely like to transition to more technically accurate terminology. But anyway, let's move on. I just wanted people to be aware that a new repo process is coming very soon. I haven't had a chance to review the latest draft of the document, but the previous agreement from November was that SIG Architecture was going to be the place that would vet new repositories. They are in keeping with the scope of Kubernetes. That has been pruned back a little bit in line with our desire to delegate decision-making to SIGs. So SIGs will be able to decide for themselves what repositories they need for the projects that are underway. And we actually created a new GitHub organization called Kubernetes SIGs. And there will be some lightweight mechanisms hopefully developed for them to get repos created in that org and to get the automation turned up and things like that. So it's kind of, we're moving away from incubator in that sense, and we want to unblock the organic work that SIGs need to do. When things get to the point of being pulled into a Kubernetes release, however, that's sort of where we want to drive the Kubernetes org towards, and that will be under the purview of SIG Architecture to make sure that, yes, this is something we want to call part of Kubernetes, and we want to be part of the Kubernetes releases. So we will need to have some kind of clear way of making that judgment. So we'll have to crisp up sort of the boundaries of what's in scope for Kubernetes and what's not in scope for Kubernetes. So I think that's some work. And a number of people around KubeCon had said, well, we need to update that what is Kubernetes page. So I think that's part of it. So we'll need to do that. And there's just one example of this issue. Also in the agenda, there's a lot of discussion in the application KEP PR about should this be a built-in API or should it start as a CRD? The KEP was drafted in terms of it being a built-in API, but I think most of the feedback was consistent that, hey, we should start this as a CRD. We actually did have discussions repeatedly and for quite a while that we want to try to make the extension mechanisms work for even for things that are important. I think Clayton may have even had something written down about that somewhere, although I couldn't find it digging through my inbox. But it's clear that we should write that down as a direction. I mean, obviously, service catalog is an example of something that bit the bullet and really pushed hard on the API to make API aggregation work. I don't think we've done anything comparable with CRDs yet. It's mostly being used out in the ecosystem, but that seems like a good position to take that, hey, we need to really start exercising these extension mechanisms, because part of the point is to constrain the growth of core. But especially since there's doesn't seem to be a great understanding of what all the needs are around this particular API. It seems like a no-brainer, but so anyway, I would like Clayton. Do you know if you have something written down about this principle, or could you like write something down about it that we could share?
Definitely Dan Gillespie from now I guess also from Red Hat. Has been a long time thinking about this as well.
Yeah, I thought I had written up, but I don't know where it is. I'll write something up and I'll ping Dan Gillespie and on it.
Cool. I did have one point or one question about the repository structure. Just the cloud provider extraction that's underway. I believe there was a unwritten agreement that they would be able to create repositories inside the Kubernetes org.
It's actually written in the previous
because they're grandfathered.
Yeah,
okay, great.
It's written in the previous incubator document, which we need to extract the bits that we believe are still valid.
Cool.
And write that down. Yeah.
And I've added that to the cloud provider extraction cap as a PR. The repository plans there. One, I guess, consideration will be the working group is concerned or has an explicit goal of preventing community fragmentation. So there will likely be other cloud providers or cloud provider implementations that would like to move to a Kubernetes controlled or CNCF owned organization. The goal is to have all of the cloud providers live on the same kind of tier, so there's not classes of them. But we're working on defining what those criteria would be, what for quality, for supporting the project in general, and for adoption. So it's not just a go hog wild, everyone load up into the boat.
Yeah, I think that's going to be an evolutionary process. In terms of maintainability, a lot of those providers, as well as the turnup code in the cluster directory, have bit rotted over time, and we don't have good ways of testing them. So there are effectively different classes of providers just due to that. Actually earlier on, I tried to get CoreOS to contribute some of their code for doing turnup, but it was just too hard to maintain in the Kubernetes repository due to everything else going on and the challenges with testing it and getting PRs through and all that. So I think actually as a direction, I would like to see eventually as many cloud providers as possible, if not all of them, move out completely. But it's gonna take time.
Yeah, I guess it puts a barrier on. So a lot of the existing cloud providers are not interested in figuring out the legal implications of transferring the code into their own organization. I imagine that to be a general case. They would much rather not own it.
So I think we're happy to leave to grandfather those who don't want to take further ownership.
For now. For now,
and I'm sort of leaning towards I don't care in the long term, as long as the 6 that we have or 7 that we have doesn't become 70.
Well, I think there will have to be criteria about they need to have tests that report back to the test dashboard and things like that.
Yes, so. That's fair.
And SLOs around issue management and regular cleanliness. I think we're well aligned.
Yeah, that's I'm sorry, my connection sucks. That is absolutely one of the primary concerns about this discussion in the working group. We're being very diligent about that conversation because we understand the implications of rogue repos popping up. So definitely don't worry. We're taking those into consideration.
Understood completely. I just want to make sure that I continue to be on the record about that. The long-term intention was that this becomes every cloud provider's problem, not Kubernetes' problem.
Yeah, I think there's a balance to be struck there between the users, the contributors to cloud providers, and the wider community.
Yes.
Yeah, for the vast majority of the cloud providers, the primary contributors are the cloud providers themselves.
Yes.
I have a plan. Step 1 was clear. Step 3 is clear. Step 2 is still a bunch of question marks.
Well, meet you at profit.
So, I mean, AWS is the exception here. They want to get more involved, but there's definitely, historically, it's been a community group that's been driving the AWS cloud provider.
Yes.
But this is a great opportunity for things like associated repos, where we say, hey, you're not, FUBAR cloud provider employed, but you want to make FUBAR cloud provider work. Cool, make an associated repo, follow the rules. Everybody can collaborate on it, but it still isn't part of.
Yeah, so for people who haven't read the repos proposal, there are 3 classes of repos. One of them, so-called core repos, those are the repos in the Kubernetes org that ideally would roll up into the Kubernetes release. SIG-related repos for other work that SIGs are undertaking, and associated repos, which are projects in the Kubernetes ecosystem that are intended to be a neutral ground for collaboration, but which aren't actually owned by the Kubernetes project itself. And that the mechanics of how all this will work is still being worked out, and especially for the associated repos, we have some answers like, yes, even if they're not officially Kubernetes or CNCF projects, we can run the LF CLA bots, but there's still questions about governance of those kinds of projects. So anyway, it's being worked on, and I think the time horizon for moving things out of the Kubernetes project, which are currently in the Kubernetes project, is going to be long. It's not urgent. Definitely the first priority is are unblocking the cloud providers who want to integrate, but don't want the code in the Kubernetes repo, and then actually moving out code that's in the Kubernetes repo itself. Moving things farther out, for example, out of the Kubernetes org, I mean, that's a lower priority and it's going to take longer. Okay, so on next items on the agenda, if nobody else has anything about that, going once, going twice.
Just to make sure I've succinctly captured our outcome from the cloud provider discussion, we're going to say existing cloud providers are grandfathered into the Kubernetes org, and the long-term intent is for cloud providers to be moved into the orgs owned by the actual cloud providers.
Owned by someone.
Yeah, I don't know about that last point.
Okay.
The ownership.
I think that's just a conversation we'll have as it becomes more technically feasible to do this. We can decide whether it makes sense to make a new org, or to put people in Kubernetes org, or to push them out into their own cloud provider orgs, or something else that we haven't thought of yet. I love plans, but I don't like exactly what I'm going to think in a year, because I'm going to be wrong.
I like planning.
Yeah. Okay, while Aaron is typing that up. So I just wanted to give people a heads up, because there's previous discussion in SIG Architecture about daemon set scheduling and whether that should use the kube scheduler or not. So I had a really long set of discussions with Bobby, who's working on preemption, about what the issues are. And he is supposed to be writing up a summary of those discussions, and there are a bunch of issues about maintainability of the daemon set code, and whether the SIG apps is doing that work, or SIG scheduling, or whatever. The desire to retain the ability to have multiple schedulers in Kubernetes, and what the use cases are for scheduler pluggability and multiple simultaneous schedulers. And then just how we expect competing schedulers, or to what degree competing schedulers are supported, and how preemption is going to work. So the short of that is that the preemption model that was developed did not accommodate multiple schedulers. That has been figured out, I believe, and through those discussions, it has been realized that multiple preemptors actually does need to be supported. And the first step towards supporting it, that is currently the scheduler was using an annotation to specify the so-called nominated node. where a pod would be scheduled once enough other pods were preempted that it could actually be placed there. That information actually needs to be visible, however, to any other entity doing scheduling, such as the daemon set scheduler or whatever, so that they don't also try to place pods there, which would create convergence problems and things like that. So the first step is to actually add a field called nominated node name currently to the pod status, because it doesn't need to be persisted necessarily. Like, it's not part of the desired state. It's just an expression that other schedulers can observe that that pod is intended to be put on that node. So Bobby has a PR out for that, and I am reviewing it. There are some additional steps and some bigger picture context about how all the resource management related control loops interact and what the plan is for supporting multiple schedulers. That's going to be written up. But the short-term direction is that the constraints, the scheduling constraints in daemon set need to continue to be in daemon set and need to be fixed and updated to support all the new scheduling features like taints and tolerations and pod affinity and anti-affinity and node affinity and anti-affinity and so on. Because the daemon set controller, in order to correctly implement its semantics, needs to know how many pods to create. However, things like resource fits, priority, those sorts of issues, it's going to rely on the kube scheduler to actually implement. So it is going to that degree, it is going to rely on the kube scheduler for scheduling, and in particular the orchestration of the preemption step, like actually draining the preempted pods and then performing the final scheduling step with the node name assignment is complex enough that makes sense. But we are going to create tests, for example, that multiple schedulers can actually work, because that's one of the concerns about just channeling all the scheduling through the scheduler, is that it will bake too many assumptions and too much policy and so on into the scheduler, and then it won't actually be pluggable, for example. So there's work that's going to happen in order to preserve the properties that we believe are important in terms of how the system works and at the layer in which the scheduler is supposed to be in the architectural layer cake. So hopefully, if you are interested in that, I dropped some links to the daemon set scheduling feature issue and the preemption umbrella issue. If you have any other, hopefully we'll get all that stuff written up soon. Was that a hand, Wojtek? Are you raising your hand? No, okay.
So if I wanted to follow up with either of these, would I go to the scheduler for SIG scheduling for priority and preemption and SIG networking for the daemon set, or?
Well, SIG scheduling is heading up fixing all this. Daemon set is actually owned by SIG apps because it's considered one of the workload controllers and it performs rolling updates and so on. And that is today the most complex part of daemon set, but there are things to work out between the daemon set controller and the node controller, and between the daemon set controller and the scheduler. And obviously, in terms of customers of daemon set, cluster lifecycle, and SIG network, in terms of CNI controllers and whatnot, do have interest in it. So I mean, it's definitely a critical building block of the system that there are multiple stakeholders in. But it is still the case that, as a whole, it's considered owned by it's in the SIG apps API group, and it's owned by SIG apps overall.
Okay. So
yeah.
Does that mean I would go to SIG apps to find out more updates about all the scheduling stuff?
Well, the SIG scheduling people are actually working on it, so it's probably going to be discussed more there, that particular aspect of it. There were concerns expressed about bootstrapping, but I think I became convinced through the discussions that it doesn't make bootstrapping worse
Okay.
than it already is.
It just changes the order. That's all.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, sorry, I got it confused, but there was a SIG network proposal to run the CNI tracker via daemon set, so I wasn't sure if that was overlapping.
Well, there are issues there, like the scheduler needs a way to determine that nodes are ready, that for things that don't need the pod network, don't have to wait for the pod network, for example. So, and there's still things to sort out there.
Okay.
But that was true for daemon set also.
Cool.
And in truth, most third-party networks today use daemon set to install their drivers anyway. So
Yes.
We're not actually changing that problem. We're just changing what code is running.
And it's somewhat related, but there's a general effort to move away from the unschedulable bit and conditions, particularly the readiness condition in this case, towards more fine-grained taints in order to control this stuff. So that effort is ongoing as well.
Yeah, I'm aware of that. I don't know if there's like an umbrella issue for that, but I've seen stuff.
Most of that work has been done. It was pushed a while back in 1.9, I believe.
There's still PRs underway.
Yes, there's still refinement. It's not the big blocking issues, especially with network not ready, are done. Those were the big ones.
Okay. Last thing on the agenda, since the proposal was initially floated through this SIG, I wanted to tell people I've been working on the proposal to formalize sub-projects. I'll present this at the community meeting to try and get wider forward feedback as well. But essentially, I opened up an issue where I talked about, roughly speaking, what a sub-project should be, some examples of what a sub-project might be from both a technical perspective for SIG apps as well as a slightly non-technical perspective from a SIG contributor experience. I then put together an initial implementation as a pull request. I'm going to talk about it at the community. My goal here is to basically get all of try and at least start with a single pass that gets all repos assigned to all SIGs. Might not be the right SIG, but it's something to start with. And then start laying a stake in the ground that like at some point in the future, we will start treating this list as authoritative. But we're not there yet. We just need help in actually defining the list of what all the sub-projects are and who they should be owned by. And there's going to have to be a whole bunch of automation that gets created to sort of help enforce this. Eventually, I think the ideal state of the future is the source of truth is all of the individual repositories and not this one place. But it's much easier to iterate on this one place right now as human beings. But that's sort of where we're headed. If you have any comments, I would appreciate them on this PR.
Yeah, it is near the top of my list to go through and flesh out the set of sub-projects.
Right. But I figure, like, I'm planning on just asking the rest of the community to make sure that this is, sort of a bottom-up approach as well, so people don't necessarily feel like they're being voluntold.
Yep, absolutely. We just need enough examples there for people to get the gist of what we're looking for.
Right. And that's the bottom of the agenda. Did anybody else have anything they wanted to discuss? Or do you want 20 minutes of our lives back? Going once?
I just wanted to check back on a couple of things that were ongoing. Is Clayton still on? No. Clayton disappeared. I was going to ask about the API review progress, but follow up with Clayton on that, I guess, elsewhere.
So I want to give a super quick update on the CAP process. I think people are starting to use it. It seems to be working okay. I think it's going to take some encouragement to get folks to feel like, hey, if it's in a SIG directory, the SIG owns this. Let's just try and keep things moving instead of sort of pontificating on PRs forever. Meanwhile, I'm working with the Contribex and trying to figure out if and when and how to make some sort of like community.kubernetes.io that I can actually start exposing the community repo in a more sort of discoverable, readable way instead of a pile of markdown on GitHub. I'm going to write a KEP on that, talking about sort of what the goals are around that, just so that we can communicate that, and then that's not me just going off and doing stuff. So, Brian?
Yeah, so I did see that you made a comment on the application KEP about, hey, let's try to get this checked in. I think one thing that would help is to be super crisp about what the bar is for getting stuff checked in, like what's critical to be agreed upon before it gets checked in. And I think there are actually only a couple of things. One is that that it's sort of well-formed as a KEP, and we need to make that
So the metadata, and there's a problem statement.
Yeah, and in particular, like, do we agree that it's targeting the right SIG, that it is a problem that SIG wants to solve, and does it have the right set of approvers? Like, I think it should be like on the order of only 4 things or something like that. Maybe 3 is too few and 7 is too many, but just a small number of things that, like, look, we agree on this, and then the KEP process will work after that. Right. Like, but if you don't have those things, then the KEP process won't work.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I'll open up a PR on the KEP process to try and really crisp that up, and then we can argue about it there about the details.
I do have a question about the merging, though, of when it's merged. If it's, say, something like SIG apps and going off and doing something that we're trying that maybe I'll end up in core, maybe not, is that something that should be a KEP, or is that something that we keep separate from a KEP? Like, where's that line between we're doing something that's kind of really ecosystem, it's not core, but it's a Kubernetes SIG going off and trying something and just seeing where it's going to go, versus something that's more focused on core? Like,
my feeling is that if it's something a SIG is going to be working on, it's fair game for a KEP.
And so it's up to the SIGs to sort of curate their own directory. Yeah. So go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just going to say, so experiments should go through a KEP, is what you're saying.
I think that the idea is that we have a well-defined format for discussing proposals and enhancement. They don't all have to end in success or code that's maintained for years. I think that it's just defining a process that allows us to talk about these things outside of a single SIG, or at least that there is a consistent way moving between SIGs to discover what's being worked on.
Yeah, it's a way to get broader feedback and to discover what's going on, and to try to maintain some level of consistency. Like, one can argue about how much in which spheres do we care most about consistency, but certainly one thing that I perceive that users value about Kubernetes is the degree of consistency across its APIs, across how even extensions work, or things out in the ecosystem, things like that. So, I'm having this discussion with somebody within Google actually about what even does Kubernetes native means. And actually, I haven't found a definition of that, but people are using that term, right? That, hey, this is a Kubernetes native thing. And that seems to resonate with the users of those things. So, I mean, obviously, people are finding it valuable to advertise themselves at least as Kubernetes native. So we should probably want a definition of that at some point as well.
Yeah,
So,
and I
Matt,
think for me, the thing that I was getting at is the difference between something that's going to be worked on to go in versus some folks in a SIG going off and doing an experiment, and where that line is for should it be a KEP or not. I think documenting that so that people have an idea on some of that purpose and not might be useful, because I was originally thinking that a KEP is, well, something that folks are going to debate and work out to try to get into something in Kubernetes, and that if it's just an experiment where you're not really sure how it's going to be or where it's going to go or if it's ever going to land anywhere, that maybe that's not something that goes in a KEP, because it's just a SIG experimenting to see what comes up.
Well,
and I think I'm getting a different flavor here, and that's where I'm trying to understand.
So I think if it's something that's really internal to the SIG, it's up to the SIG to talk about, to figure out how they want to document that. And I think, provide guidelines and consistency across that SIG. I think the KEP is a tool that a SIG can use to organize and communicate its own efforts. When things start crossing SIGs, that's when we need some sort of standard that actually is more discoverable and is more rational across all the different sort of parts of the project. And so if something is local to a SIG, I think it's up to the SIG to figure out how they want to organize and communicate that. And the KEP process is available, but I don't think anybody is saying that it's mandatory, at least not at this point.
Yeah, I also think, coming back to the 3 different flavors of repos, things in core or the Kubernetes org definitely are going to, KEPs are going to be strongly recommended, at least for those things. If you ever want to get into Kubernetes release. For the SIG sponsored repos, I think it's still going to be encouraged. For associated repos, no. Like it's not going to, a KEP won't make sense for those, right? So I think there will be some guidance around those. One thing that we're trying to do for the so-called core repos is really to strengthen the consistency across those repos in terms of following our technical principles and conventions, communication within the project, even the operation of how those projects work with respect to GitHub automation and things like that. Like that's the direction we're going, is kind of ratcheting up the consistency for that tight set of things that we need to make sure can hit a release in a predictable way, for example. But the things that are sort of farther out in the space, like things that are not going into releases or they're just experiments, those won't be as tightly regulated.
So while we're talking about KEPs, though, just to expand on that a little bit, say you've got a project that isn't part of a release, but is a sub-project, like something like Minikube, right? Should that sub-project, does that sub-project, even though it's on Kubernetes, need to do KEPs? And should there be some kind of, second part is, should there be some kind of other organizational, like in the SIG that owns it, should there be a subdirectory for Minikube so you can more easily navigate this structure?
I think to your second question, definitely.
Yeah.
That there should be component subdirectories within SIGs for navigation purposes. I would suggest that a project like Minikube use KEPs if they are trying to have their work communicated to the wider Kubernetes community. I think that is one of the primary cases of work crossing a SIG boundaries, between the implementation, the SIG doing the implementation, and SIG docs or SIG PM that has to communicate or is trying to communicate about it.
Yeah, and as far as it hitting a release, actually, I kind of would like Minikube to be part of the release process so that we ensure that when we actually have a Kubernetes release, we also have Minikube at the same time supporting that release. That would be an awesome place to get, because Minikube is a critical way that people have to kick the tires of Kubernetes, do local development, and things like that. It really unblocked. Just for example, we had no reasonable way in our documentation to have tutorials that would end up in this like choose your own adventure thing at the beginning of every single tutorial, figuring out how to get a Kubernetes cluster. Like Minikube just totally solved that.
I would also say that like the metadata that we have on those things will be an evolving thing, right? So the sub-project that a KEP is associated with could be a piece of metadata that we add as we get more formal about defining sub-projects. There might be metadata that we find is just noise, and so we end up eliminating that because it creates friction for folks, so we find other ways to derive it. So there's more opportunities there.
Yeah, I could see, as we formalize sub-projects, we will definitely want to add that, but probably a lot of KEPs aren't specific to a specific sub-project.
That would be an optional thing.
Yeah. That would be an optional thing.
Yeah, just as people pick it up, these are the kinds of questions they might have. Maybe a fact section, something like that just fills in, here's some kinds of questions you might have, here's some of the direction. This is a question I had when I started looking at this.
Yeah. All right, well, I'll definitely tag you on the update that I'm going to do to that. Okay, Matt?
Sounds great.
Nothing about KEPs. I always defaulted to just toss around a Google Doc, and so it'd be helpful to understand the immediate benefits to me for the additional friction and metadata for why I would go through all that rather than just do a Google Doc.
Aaron, I think that's a great point, because we're going to ask people to do something that is more work from their current flow. What benefit will they pragmatically get from this to do extra work and have extra friction? What's the carrot for them to go chase it?
Yeah, so to answer that, I think there's two things. Again, this is within a SIG for stuff for organizing that SIG. It's up to the SIG to make that decision. I think in terms of stuff that starts crossing more parts of the project, having more visibility, having more discoverability there, having sort of some official stamp with the KEP numbers, and official approvals will will sort of, make people take that stuff more seriously. And I think over time, especially, this is why I think the website is so important, is that you put this up on a website, you make it look more official. It's the same damn content, but all of a sudden there's a discoverability, there's a search aspect, there's a sort of officialness that gets imbued on it with that
Okay.
I think people will want. Go ahead, Brian, sorry.
I heard that as a request to document the benefit to you.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah. More than just Matt.
Yes.
And I just want to add here, if you're Minikube or something like that, hold on, Aaron, I'll quick here. If you're Minikube or something like that, like getting the word out, right, getting better communication, I don't know that that's a problem they have that they're going to feel needs to be solved. And so maybe look at some of those sub-projects and say, what would cause a sub-project or one of these things to want to do it from their perspective of being a little bit broken off from the normal Kubernetes stuff. And something like Minikube or why am I forgetting, the service broker or something like that might be a good case to look at.
Yeah, that's just it exactly. Like I felt like I roughly understood kept to be something that was going to impact changes across the project as a whole, whereas kept for what I consider to be a relatively well-contained sub-project like Minikube didn't like confuse me. That seemed to change that definition there. So I could see it if it's like a Kubernetes enhancement proposal to make sure that Minikube is always packaged in as part of the release, although honestly, that could just be a SIG release proposal too. I don't know. But yeah, documenting the benefits would be helpful because I guarantee for my SIG, we just used Google Docs. And I'm really proud that we have gotten that far. To introduce more friction might encourage people to just make the work happen without actually calling the work out before they do it. And that's not what I want to incentivize.
Yeah, I think it's it is going to be hard, as someone who also has used Google Docs for various things. I do have to agree that just going through GitHub is painful given the volume of things going through GitHub and the amount of so it's, in the moment, the discoverability aspect, it doesn't feels like a negative sometimes for it to be going through GitHub. In the longer term, the discoverability flips, right? Like if it's checked into GitHub, it's much easier for other people to find and track. So while you're doing,
and if it has a website, it'll be that much easier.
Yeah. So while you're doing the work, I think it's more of a hindrance than anything else. But it's the artifact that's produced is a benefit to the project as a whole once that's actually checked in. So I mean, in general, we have a couple of goals with not just the kept process, but overall through the steering committee and SIG Architecture and things like that, which is we're trying to make the project function better, right? For some definition of better, and there are some attributes that we can work on there. But at the scale that we're at, we're trying to formalize things that were previously informal and just discussed amongst a small group of people, but we're not a small group of people anymore.
Yeah, I totally get that. Okay, sorry, Matt, your hand's up.
Yeah, I was just going to say, one of the things for something like Kubernetes Core, where we talk about it slowing down the pace of development, about being far more intentional to get things in, putting some more bureaucracy first to think it through and talk it through with a wider group of people makes sense. If you're kind of a small, slow, fast-moving sub-project, you want to be action first as you experiment, not necessarily bureaucracy first. Because a lot of opinions, you bring something to a committee, it's a great way to slow it down. It's one of those ways to even kill things, right? And if you're on a small sub-project or something like that, you want to experiment. You want to play with action first. You want to let them be fast-moving and not feel hindered. And so I think however we explain it needs to be done so in a way that is intentional along those lines as well.
So Matt, I think, yeah, that's why I don't think anybody's saying that we're going to legislate that all SIGs must use this for all decisions, right? I mean, this is like if things are scoped within a project or a SIG, it's like it's there if they want to use it, but there's no need. I do think that there's different parts of. I think that velocity and that deliberateness actually scales both with the maturity of the project, but also the problem domain also. There are parts where, like you're doing stuff with storage. You want to be very careful about stuff. You don't want to fly by the seat of your pants, right? So there's different domains that really require different deliberateness and different stages of the project. So yeah.
I was just going to basically say the same thing, Joe. We should make sure that whenever we talk about projects and SIGs, we emphasize that we value iteration and prototyping and velocity when the blast radius is small. And as the blast radius gets bigger, that's when things necessarily slow down.
Well, I also agree with a lot of what Matt said in terms of we want people to experiment. I think we definitely don't want everything to be waterfall. We want people to experiment. We want people to do proof of concept. At some point it becomes this trade-off between how much work are you willing to throw away if you actually want or need to get it into a lot of the core components. So for example, there was an initial daemon set proof of concept. It was built that was entirely thrown away and redone, and it was thousands of lines of code, which sometimes that's actually maybe not that much code, but there are going to be cliffs where someone says, well, yeah, this proof of concept is kind of enough work now. I want to go through a KEP because I want to get it in, or actually no, a KEP doesn't make sense. I'll just make this a separate project or an affiliated repo or something like that. But I definitely do want people to prototype, and one can argue whether the application proposal should have been a KEP in the first place. I think that came from the suggestion of some people that it be a built-in API. If it, from the beginning, if it were envisioned as an extension, then a prototype to actually demonstrate what the value of the thing could be would have totally been the way that I would have gone with that. But I think to some degree, Ken kind of fell on a sword and said, hey, I'll exercise the KEP process to try it out. So anyway, that was everything on the agenda.
Yeah,
all right.
We are at time, basically.
And y'all can look for a PR from me, and we can totally bike shed on the KEP stuff there.
Sounds great. Okay, thanks, everybody. Happy Thursday.